Welcome to the third and final part of our introductory episode. As promised, we'll start this episode with our first rationality word problem and a discussion of what normally goes wrong when people answer it. Then we'll look at what the Bible says about thinking and how cognitive science and the Bible both seem to be addressing some of the same problems. And then at the end, I'll have a promise and a challenge for you. So let's get started as I insert the video for our first word problem. The Jack, Ann, and George problem. This is the Jack, Ann, and George problem from Hector Levesque. Jack is looking at Ann, but Ann is looking at George. Jack is married, but George is not. Is a married person looking at an unmarried person? A, yes. B, no. C, cannot be determined. Now I'll repeat the question for those who are listening and not watching. Be sure that you answer before moving on with the video. Here it is again. Jack is looking at Ann, but Ann is looking at George. Jack is married, but George is not. Is a married person looking at an unmarried person? A, yes. B, no. C, cannot be determined. Pause here to answer before continuing. Again, this is the Jack, Ann, and George problem from Hector Levesque, a cognitive scientist. About 80% of people get this problem wrong. The most popular answer by far is C, cannot be determined, but that answer is incorrect because it can be determined from the information given whether a married person is looking at an unmarried person in this scenario. The correct answer, therefore, is yes. Now let me demonstrate that yes is the correct answer. Here's what we're told. Jack is looking at Ann, but Ann is looking at George. We're also told that Jack is married and that George is unmarried. We are not told, of course, whether Ann is married or not, and that's where most people get hung up. We'll talk about the big question of Ann's marital status in a minute, but first let me explain that as intriguing as that question may be, it's simply not necessary to know in order to solve the problem. As it turns out, there is a workaround by which we can solve it even if we don't know Ann's marital status. The trick here is to consider all the possibilities. In cognitive science, this is called fully disjunctive reasoning, and we'll talk more about that below too. So let me demonstrate how it's simply not necessary to know what Ann's marital status is in order to solve this problem. Ann's marital status can only have one of two states. That is, either she's married or she's unmarried. There are no other choices. So even though we don't know which one she is, we can use fully disjunctive reasoning to consider all the possibilities. Let's list them. In the first case, we'll replace the question mark under Ann's name with an M for married. We'll also try it with a U for unmarried later, but for now, let's see what would happen if she were married. Our original question was whether a married person is looking at an unmarried person. So if Ann were married, we would see that married Jack is looking at married Ann, and we would also see that married Ann is indeed looking at unmarried George. And that's what we're supposed to be looking for in this problem, is a married person looking at an unmarried person. So if Ann were married, then our answer would be yes, a married person is looking at an unmarried person. So that's one possibility, and now let's consider the other one. Remember, there are only two possible marital statuses for Ann, married or unmarried, so let's consider the case in which she is unmarried. We'll replace that M under Ann's name with a U for unmarried. And here we see right away that married Jack is indeed looking at unmarried Ann. That would give us a yes in this scenario too. So here are the two things we've learned. Number one, if Ann is married, then the answer to the problem is yes. And number two, if Ann is unmarried, then the answer to the problem is yes. So those are the only two possibilities, and since the answer is the same in either case, we can determine logically that the answer to the problem simply must be yes, for there is no possible state in which the answer could be no. Now let's talk about why people get so hung up on this. Remember, 80% of people miss this problem. Part of it is because they get hooked on the idea that we don't know what Ann's marital status is. They latch onto that like a dog on a bone, and they lose sight of everything else. So let me give you a similar problem, but one that is without anything like this to get hooked on. Suppose I were to tell you that Miss Beasley is either a poodle or a cocker spaniel. And suppose I were to put the question to you, is Miss Beasley a dog? You could fixate on the fact that you don't know which kind of dog she is, but you could quickly reason that since she's either a poodle or a cocker spaniel, and since both are breeds of dog, Miss Beasley simply must be a dog, even though we don't know what breed she is. And so it is with this Jack, Ann, and George problem. It's a little more complicated than the Miss Beasley problem, but the same rules of logic apply. Just as we don't need to know which breed Miss Beasley is to get the correct answer to the problem, we don't need to know Ann's marital status to get the correct answer to the Jack, Ann, and George problem. Why then do so many of us miss the Jack, Ann, and George problem? Remember, about 80% of us miss it, and this is one of the ones I missed when I first saw it. We need to know this about ourselves, and if we can learn why, we can learn a good deal about why our society is like it is. People tend to fixate on the fact that Ann's marital status is not given, and without knowing it, they answer the problem as if answering a different question altogether. That is, rather than answering, is a married person looking at an unmarried person, they answer, can Ann's marital status be determined from the information given? The answer to that latter question, of course, is a firm no, but that's not the question we were asked now, is it? Even so, most people presented with this question will substitute the easier-to-handle question for the one we are actually asked. In cognitive science, this nasty little trick is called attribute substitution, but I generally avoid using that term because it's fairly abstract and hard to get a handle on. So in cases like this, I like to call it question substitution or problem substitution, both of which terms are easier to grasp quickly. That is, we are swapping out the question or problem that was given us for another question or problem precisely because the second one is easier. I notice that this tends to happen fairly often on internet discussion groups, where respondents often end up answering something other than what was actually asked. The undisciplined mind will gravitate toward doing something that it can get done easily before working hard to figure out what will actually solve the problem at hand. And in the practical world, this sort of thing can get pretty messy really fast. Imagine this. Imagine that the men's room toilets at the office have overflowed. There's our problem. But in our scenario, let's imagine that the office manager, faced with this problem, decides that the best thing to do in this situation is to turn on the air conditioner, since it's a little warm on this particular day anyway. That response, while it may be useful in and of itself, is simply not a good response to the main problem at hand. In fact, it's completely unrelated to the problem at hand. And so it is with fixating on how Ann's marital status is unknown. While it's true that we don't know, it turns out to be ultimately unimportant that we don't know, because there's a logical workaround. So since there's a way around it, fixating on our lack of information about Ann does nothing to get us to the right answer to the problem. Now, to our credit, those of us who give in to the problem substitution in the Jack, Ann, and George problem usually nail it after switching to the easier problem. We are, in fact, 100% correct that Ann's marital status is unknown and unknowable from the information given. And perhaps that manager also did a great thing when he turned on the air conditioner, but turning on the air conditioner did nothing to solve the problem of the plumbing, just as fixating on Ann's marital status does nothing to solve the Jack, Ann, and George problem correctly. I should note one very important thing about this problem, about problem substitution or attribute substitution, because everyone needs to know this. According to cognitive scientist Keith Stanovich, whose team studied this Jack, Ann, and George problem extensively, people of high intelligence were no more likely to solve the Ann problem and similar problems than were people of lower intelligence. If told to reason through all the alternatives, the subject of higher intelligence would have done so more efficiently. However, without instruction, they defaulted to computationally simple cognition while solving problems. They were cognitive misers like everyone else. Intelligence and the tendency toward spontaneous disjunctive reasoning can be quite unrelated. And that's the end of the quotation. In other words, just because you're smart, that doesn't mean that your brain is going to automatically kick into action to consider all the possibilities. People all across the IQ spectrum can do this, though, even if some can do it faster than others, just as some can run faster than others, and some can reach higher than others. This is very good news for us because it means that we're not doomed, on account of a lower IQ, to be irrational. just as we're not guaranteed by a higher IQ to be rational. So to sum up the bigger lessons of the Jack, Ann, and George problem, number 1, some problems take more mental work than one finds convenient or easy. Number 2, just because you don't know one piece of information, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't solve a problem. Number 3, considering all the possibilities is a really good strategy when the number of possibilities is manageable. Number 4, your strong hunch in a matter is not necessarily the right answer. You need to decouple from that and consider the other possibilities if you want to be sure you've got it right. And number 5, be sure you're answering the question that was actually asked or solving the problem that was actually presented. For more on the Jack, Ann, and George problem, as well as on attribute substitution and fully disjunctive reasoning, see the discussion in Chapter 6 of What Intelligence Tests Miss, The Psychology of Rational Thought by Keith Stanovich. So that's the end of the Jack, Ann, and George problem video. This is one of the first few problems I read when I began to study cognitive science, and I missed it, along with about 80% of everybody else. I got suckered by that irresistible C answer, cannot be determined. I didn't think through all the possibilities. I didn't take enough time to think it through. I was utterly certain, and I was right, that Ann's marital status cannot be determined from the information given, but I did not see that that was not the question that was being asked. I mean, I saw it, but I didn't see it. That is, I knew that we couldn't know her marital status, but I was wrong that this would make any difference. I failed to decouple from this strong sense that I was understanding the problem in order to step back and re-examine it all from a different angle. And while we're on the topic of decoupling, let me take this opportunity to introduce the first video in this series of reality-based thinking skills. It's the green videos. Here's what I mean by decoupling. It's a huge thinking skill that we'll talk about a lot. Decoupling. The act of temporarily suspending one's own mental status in order to view or consider a matter in a different way. In RBT, decoupling refers to the deliberate and diligent suspending of mental operations such as these: assumptions, biases, beliefs, opinions, goals, desires, moods, grudges, agendas, etc., in order to view or consider a matter objectively and without distraction, for what it really is. This is a deliberate and voluntary operation of the reflective mind and is also called a System 1 override. Decoupling can be compared to clearing one's desk of all the clutter before starting in on a new and important task. Mature thinkers understand that decoupling is key in avoiding erroneous thoughts, decisions, and beliefs. So that's the end of the Jack, Ann, and George problem that I picked for this first episode. It's such a great example of the need for decoupling. For those of us who missed this problem the first time we saw it, could we have thought through it more carefully? You bet we could, but we just didn't do it. We had those faculties turned off. Just like that horse using only 3 legs, or just like Curly with his eyes shut, we didn't have that particular mental faculty engaged. What was it about us that we would be so driven to give a final answer, to make a decision on this problem without having really thought it through? Most of us jump on that cannot be determined answer, and it makes you wonder how we would have answered if that option had not been given to us. Most of us have taken lots of multiple choice tests in our lives, and seeing an answer on the page tends to legitimize it in our minds, at least as plausible, even if it's not. That's what we all tend to be like if we haven't yet trained ourselves to do better. And we're like this about a lot of things, both important and unimportant things. And I have to apologize to you if you happen to be one of that small percentage who did not miss this particular problem today. Had I picked another of the problems that will be in the upcoming rationality quotient test, chances are very good you would have missed that one. That is, unless you've already trained yourself in these various RBT skills. Now, what does this Jack, Ann, and George problem have to do with the real world? In our culture, we each have a great many beliefs about which we feel rather strongly, and a great many of them have not been examined, or at least not enough to reach a reality-based answer. We get lots of things wrong. And you don't have to think about this very much to know it's true, because if nothing else, you see lots and lots of other people out there disagreeing with one another, So we can reason that they can't all be right. We can reason that somebody's got to be wrong when there's a disagreement. And sometimes it's both sides, or all three, or all four sides, however many are involved, who have got at least some parts of their understanding of a thing wrong. And that brings me to my personal favorite, cognitive bias. We'll talk more in later episodes about what cognitive biases are and how they work, but this particular one is pretty easy to grasp, especially since it's written in the form of the way we might think it. If we were to dare to say it out loud, here it is. If I were wrong about this, I would know it. I think this is really funny, and we can laugh about the cluelessness of someone who would say this, but actually, most of us tend to operate this way ourselves quite a lot, whether we would actually put it into words or not, and whether we realize we're doing it or not. And here's another bias that's quite similar in nature. If my expert were wrong about this, I would know it. We can fool ourselves, but the truth of the matter is that if we are not examiners, like Mark Twain wrote about, we could go all our lives believing something and rarely have a clue that it's not as accurate as we think it is. If you're not an examiner, you have no idea in how many ways reality might be at odds with your various thoughts, decisions, and beliefs about things. And then there's also the question of how good an examiner you might be so far in life. Well, this show is about having the courage to look and see, rather than just leaving our eyes shut like Curly in the Three Stooges skit I mentioned. It's about having the courage to go find out, and then, based on what we discover, to correct ourselves accordingly. It's about having the courage to start using that leg again, and I'm referring to the horse analogy here, of course, even after having deliberately neglected it for so long. Now let's talk about the Bible and what it says about thinking, because this is really important to a lot of people, and I think there's a lot of confusion and disagreement on this subject. I discuss the Bible regularly with people, and I notice that there are two general camps in Christianity about this subject. Some find the subject of thinking quite ordinary and commonsensical, but others get apprehensive about it, as if it is somehow unspiritual or carnal or even satanic. They'll show you a verse or two that suggests to them that the Christian ought to be suspicious of the human mind. But I'm going to suggest that there are lots of passages in the Bible that aren't consistent with that idea, and that would make a difference in the way a lot of Christians think about thinking if only they were popularly known and discussed. I don't think that this apprehension about thinking was the same back in Bible times. I think that's a new thing. I think that back in Bible times, they were not taught to avoid thinking, but rather how to do it right. Now, I don't intend to prove all this on this episode, but I want to give you a few passages to think about, to show that my ideas on this subject are not completely unfounded, and that they're worth the effort to examine. So here are a few one-liners from the Bible, in no particular order, that ought to give us pause if we're the sort to be suspicious of thinking. I'll read just the verses themselves, and I'll leave the references on the screen for those who would like to watch the video and look them up later. Come now, and let us reason together, says the Lord. Give careful thought to your ways. The first to plead his case seems right until another comes along and examines him. Stop judging by mere appearances, but instead judge correctly. A man should examine himself. For as he thinks in his heart, so is he. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Do not be children in your thinking, be infants in evil, but in your thinking be mature. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. Do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment. Do not deceive yourselves. If anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know. If we judged ourselves rightly, we would not be judged. Let no one deceive himself. The mature have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. Test yourselves to see if you are in the faith. Examine yourselves. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. We could dig into this for hours, examining what these passages say and examining all the implications of them. and I dare say that a lot of people would find it all quite surprising. Surely, a lot of non-Christians who think that the Bible is a bunch of fluff might well be surprised to find that it talks so much about sound reasoning and the need for sober judgment, and the need to avoid fooling oneself. Interestingly, these are the same things that are talked about in so many of those cognitive science books on rationality that I read. But I'll tell you who else would likely find these verses surprising, and that's a lot of the Christians. I don't mean all the Christians, mind you, but I don't mean just a few either. It seems that for many, thinking has become taboo, and I don't think that the Bible is really what's driving that, because here are all these passages that seem to suggest that God expects believers to be doing some good thinking. So that's why I wanted to share these Bible one-liners briefly in this first episode. No, this series is not about Christian apologetics, and I'm not trying to turn it into an effort in evangelism. But I'm also not trying to avoid the topic. In fact, as I watch the ongoing debate about religion in this country, I find a great many instances in which both sides are simply wrong, where they have not really examined the evidence, or where they've examined it poorly, making the usual cognitive errors, including the errors that are common in the Jack, Ann, and George problem we discussed earlier in this very episode. Now, in a couple of minutes, I'm going to end this first episode with a promise and a challenge, but before I do that, I want to make sure that you're not misunderstanding my attitude on this whole subject, because a lot of people will do that very thing, and I know they will because I see it again and again in real-world discussion and debate. See, I'm afraid that you're going to make a mistake that a lot of people will make when it comes to talking about what kind of people we are. I'm afraid you're going to assume I'm saying something I'm not saying. I'm afraid you're going to take it like I'm fussing at the world for being terrible thinkers, and that I'm telling them they're all total losers and that they're terrible people. Well, the fact of the matter is that with most people, there's a lot to love. There are a lot of things to like about many of us. Obviously, some have more virtues and accomplishments than others, and that's part of my point. We're all different. And some of you are going to be better at thinking than others. That's just how it is. But almost nobody is going to be as good at thinking as he thinks he is. Let me say that again. Almost nobody is going to be as good at thinking as he or she thinks he or she is. Now, in our culture, I'm supposed to follow up a statement like that with the words, and that's okay. I'm supposed to tell you, nobody's as good at thinking as he thinks he is, and that's okay. But see, I don't think that's okay. I don't think this is good about us. In fact, I think it's a pretty serious oversight in our culture, something that a more diligent people would do something substantial about. So it's not okay. But I want to put this in perspective because life is about more than just the way we think. Yes, what we think is awfully important. How we do it says a great deal about us. But that's not the only important thing in life, and a lot of people are very accomplished in some other very important and likable, lovable qualities. I'm talking about things like kindness, generosity, patience, having a sacrificial nature, being honest, being loyal, diligent, being hardworking, being caretakers of others or providers for others, being self-sufficient, being good counselors, being thoughtful, being beautiful or handsome, being talented, being accomplished in career or school, being athletically accomplished, being accomplished in the arts, in music or dance or whatever else, being healthy, having a great sense of humor, being entertaining to others, being hospitable to others, being philosophical, being faithful and loyal, and on it goes. Chances are really good that you, dear listener, have one or more of these qualities, and I'm in favor of all those things. I think the world would be better if we had more and more of all of it. So this show is about adding one more thing to a list like this, reality-based thinking. Now, when I say reality-based thinking, I'm talking about three things in particular. 1, honesty. 2, rationality. And 3, responsibility. And we will talk about that all day long as we go. RBT, or reality-based thinking, is my name for a whole set of thinking skills and values. I've got to warn you, though, this show is not for intellectual sissies. This is a show for people who want to roll up their sleeves and really accomplish something with the minds that they have. It's for people who have the desire and the courage to see the world as it really is. And that's all I'm going to say for this episode, except to leave you with one promise. I don't want to believe anything that's false, and consequently, I don't want to say anything that's false. I don't want to pollute the world with more misinformation or disinformation, which is lies as opposed to errors. I don't want to say anything that's even the least bit false. And so here's my challenge for you. If you can catch me in an error, and I don't mean that I'm trying to sneak errors by you, but if you can catch me in an error, if you can find me making an error, I want you to tell me so. I want you to contact me either through the comments on the video at YouTube or through the contact page on my website. And if you can demonstrate to me that I'm wrong about something, I will correct it. I will do it publicly, and I will thank you for helping your fellow human to get something straight. I've got to warn you, though, I'm no pushover. You're going to have to prove it using standard tools like logic, fact, and sourcing. But if you can do that, then I'll be very glad to improve myself, no matter how embarrassing my errors may have been. It can sting, but it's just the right thing to do, because, again, I believe that self-correction is the rightful duty of all humans. So with that, I'll wrap up this first episode, this introduction to what will eventually turn into a whole series. It remains to be seen how often I'll be able to produce the episodes here at the beginning, but I'd eventually like to aim at one per week, as I don't think I could produce them well at a rate any more frequent than that. I hope you've enjoyed it, that I've piqued your interest enough that you'll be sure to catch the other episodes. If you like what you've seen and heard, please take a moment to help the cause by liking, sharing, and commenting. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel for Reality-Based Thinking, and you can subscribe to the website at realitybasedthinking.com. You can also like the Facebook page for the Society for Reality-Based Thinking, where I publish helpful memes a few times a week. If you want to get a jump start on how I think that reality-based thinking relates to American politics, find my novel at Amazon. It's called The Extraordinary Visit of Benjamin True, The State of the Union as No One Else Would Tell It. It's about an angel who pops in to take over the State of the Union address. He simply tells the president, "I'll be speaking tonight," and tells him that he can reschedule his own speech for some other time. Then he proceeds to walk through the big picture of American politics from the unique point of view of one who sees everything as it actually is, as opposed to how things are normally framed for us to see them. If you're a thinker, there's a lot in this book for you to chew on. It's got some action and some humor and a lot of witty discussion and some solid history, and it gives a lot of reasons to hope again. So I hope you'll get a copy today and dig in. If you want to get in touch with me for a question or to book a speaking engagement, you can do it through the contact form at realitybasedthinking.com. I can't promise that I'll be able to respond to every question, but I'll definitely read them all. So thanks again for joining me on Reality-Based Thinking, Rethinking the World with Jack Pelham.